Hello, and welcome back to WinksThinks. I am your host, Sean Winkler, and this is episode 4. Today I'm going to start off the show with a story, and please be forewarned that it's a story that's disturbing, but it's one that needs to be told because it's true. On the night of the 15th of May, 2010, Khalif Browder, a 16-year-old African-American male, was on his way home with a friend from a party in Bronx, New York City, when he was stopped by the NYPD. As the officers pulled up, a man in the passenger seat of the squad car, Roberto Batista, assured the officers that yes, that's them, as he alleged that Browder and his friend were the two men who had assaulted him and stolen his camera, iPad, and credit card. Browder and his friend were handcuffed and driven to the 48th Police Precinct Station, where they were assured that they were only being brought in for questioning. After some 17 hours, however, questioning would turn out to be the least of their problems. Both men were charged with robbery, grand larceny, and assault, and as Browder was on probation for a previous offense, itself of a dubious nature, he was not allowed to go free. Even if he had been, with his bail set at $3,000, his family was unable to afford it, and so according to the law, he was to await trial in one of the country's most notorious prisons, Rikers Island. He was not only being sent to Rikers Island, however, but the prison's Robert N. Daverin Center, which is designated for some of its most violent offenders. One can hardly imagine the fate that Browder had in store. For starters, along with the other inmates, he was not allowed laundry facilities and was forced to wash his clothes in a rusty metal bucket. When fights broke out among the prisoners, guards would line them up to beat them at random until someone claimed responsibility. They were warned that if they reported their beatings to higher staff, the guards would find a way of putting them in solitary confinement. If harassment from the guards wasn't enough, Browder also had trouble with prison gangs, who made him a target for refusing to cooperate with them. After an altercation with one particular gang member, Browder was placed in solitary confinement, where he would eventually spend the next 2 years of his life. As this was all happening, Browder's case continued to be delayed due to a backlog in the court system, and his refusal to accept plea bargains as he upheld his innocence meant that his stay continued to extend indefinitely. It was not until after a total of more than 3 years, on the 29th of May 2013, that Browder would again see the light of day, as Roberto Batista, Browder's accuser, simply left the United States and dropped all charges. Outside of prison, however, Browder was anything but a free man, as the physical and mental trauma that he endured under imprisonment began pushing him to the brink of suicide. In an article from Vibe magazine from 2013, he told reporters that, quote, "People tell me because I have this case against the city that I'm all right, but I'm not. I'm messed up. I know that I might see some money from this case, but that's not going to help me mentally. I'm scarred, because there are certain things that changed about me in there, and they might not go back." On the 6th of June, 2015, Browder's mother would come home to find her son hanging from an air conditioning unit outside of his bedroom window. He was 22 years old. While the facts of the case overwhelmingly point to Browder's innocence, whether you believe him to be innocent or guilty doesn't really matter. Let's imagine for a second that Browder was guilty. Does that really make it any better? You'll notice that in my recounting of his story, I don't use the word suicide to speak of Browder's death, because while it may have been by his own hand that he passed, his final act was only one link in a long chain of precipitating circumstances that backed him further and further to the edge. Browder's death implicates a system that is by its nature violent, that even when working, proceeding according to its rules, spoken or unspoken, of maintaining order, is no less lethal of a weapon than any knife or pistol. Because if the dispersion of that system makes its source difficult to pinpoint, its effects assure us that it is every bit present as a deeply ingrained part of our reality. If Browder's story was an isolated incident, it would of its own be a sickening display of injustice. But as it is one of the many told and untold stories of the men and women behind bars in the United States, it is a testament to a crisis in the American criminal justice system, not one of an absence of law and order, but of its excesses against its own people. This brings us to the subject of today's episode, mass incarceration. The American prison system stands apart, as if not the worst in terms of its conditions, certainly as the single largest prison system the world has ever seen. At 2.3 million, its prison population dwarfs that of every other nation, whether you count it in sheer numbers or per capita. China and India are the only two countries larger in population than the United States, each with almost 3 times as many citizens. But while the US is home to 5% of the world's peoples, it houses 25% of the world's prisoners. And if Adam Gopnik's article from The New Yorker, The Caging of America, is correct, As of 2012, the U.S.'s total prison population and rate of incarceration exceeds those even of the Gulag system in the Soviet Union during its most repressive period under the rule of Joseph Stalin. And while it is, I think, safe to say that the conditions in the Gulag were certainly worse, let's not fool ourselves into thinking that we are comparing anything less than two different rings of hell. Many assertions are often made, however, in defense of the prison system and of its immutability. Surely, they say, the crime rates in the United States are much higher than in other Western industrialized nations. Surely the system deters crime and even reforms some prisoners wherever possible. At its worst, it's a necessary evil, as there simply are no other good options. And after all, we simply can't help everybody. These assertions are parroted time and time again, but unfortunately, none of them are much more than mere fantasies. The US's crime rates are in fact unexceptional compared to other Western industrialized nations. To provide one statistic, crime rates in the US between the 1960s through the 1990s were almost identical to those of Finland and Germany. But during the same period, the American incarceration rate quadrupled, while that in Finland dropped by 60%, and in Germany it remained constant. Prison has also not proven itself to be all that effective in deterring crime, as the wave of mass incarceration during the 1970s and 1980s saw a massive crime increase. In fact, right before mass incarceration started, the crime rate in the country was at an all-time low. Surely, then, it must reform prisoners. With the recidivism rate in the United States averaging around 60% within 5 years of release, this simply isn't true either, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out why. For most of life behind bars, prisoners are confined to tiny cell blocks, their lives day in and day out being regimented into a routine that they have no power over. If released back into society, even the simplest of decisions can be daunting for the ex-convict. But that's only the beginning. Inmates are in a constant state of hyper-alertness and hyper-vigilance, as the chances of being assaulted in prison are almost constant. The capacity to exercise violence is essential to one's survival among the prison population, and any sign of vulnerability risks making oneself a target. This can give prisoners PTSD-like symptoms that are not so different from those experienced by soldiers after returning home from combat. This is not even counting the disastrous effects of the increasingly common solitary confinement, the effects of imprisonment on families, friends, and communities of prisoners, not only when the prisoners are behind bars, but when they are released back into communities. The American prison system has also been one of the top breeding grounds for some of the world's most notorious gangs, such as the Mexican Mafia, Nuestra Familia, United Blood Nation, and the Aryan Brotherhood. And for those of you who think that prisoners are beyond help, tell that to the 40% nonviolent offenders who are behind bars, many of whom are in for drug offenses, and if treated differently, could be recuperated, and also leaving more resources to help with violent offenders. And for those who say that there are no other options, the National Advisory Commission on Criminal Justice Standards and Goals, a committee organized by the federal government back in 1973, does not agree either, as they drew the conclusion that, quote, the prison, the reformatory, and the jail have achieved only a shocking record of failure. There is overwhelming evidence that these institutions create rather than prevent crime, end quote. And they suggested that the country not only stop building more facilities, but even begin phasing them out altogether. But the opposite happened. The last 50 years have seen an almost eightfold increase in the prison population, from 357,292 in 1970 to 2,306,200 in 2014. From the perspective of dealing with crime, then, imprisonment seems almost entirely nonsensical. But that's why you simply cannot remain too attached to the idea that the primary function of prison is to prevent or minimize crime or reform criminals. The prison system has in fact another role to play, and it's one that it is executing just fine. As the sites for numerous industries that constitute a yearly profit of some $2 billion, the American prison system is in fact a highly lucrative business, with prisoners themselves being an ideal workforce. Shut away from the rest of society, these men and women make the perfect source of exploitation, one that has no ability to unite and form unions, no ability to claim benefits, no ability to organize, and few representatives on the outside who are willing to stand up for them. Not entitled to a minimum wage, some are paid as low as 95 cents an hour, making them an extraordinary source of profit. The relationship between the prison system and private enterprise has a name, one originally coined in the grassroots, but popularized by scholar activists like Mike Davis and Angela Davis, who call it the prison industrial complex. Echoing the words of President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who warned in his farewell address to the nation on the 17th of January 1961 that the nation was becoming increasingly dependent on military manufacturing with the so-called military industrial complex, the prison industrial complex is something similar. Angela Davis defines it as, quote, the exploitation of prison labor by private corporations through an array of relationships that link those corporations, government, and correctional communities, as well as media, unquote. It is by way of this system that I'll try to explain the crisis of mass incarceration, and the claims that I'll be making are essentially no different than those of Angela Davis in her book Are Prisons Obsolete?, Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish, the Netflix documentary by Ava DuVernay entitled 13th, as well as various scientific articles, some of which I have already made use of above. Now, the prison industrial complex is often mistakenly taken to refer to private, for-profit prisons, which were initiated in the early 1980s and which now house around 8.4% of the country's prison population and counting. But the story of extracting profit from prison labor begins long before the founding of private prisons, being traceable all the way back to the very beginnings of the modern prison system itself. For the remainder of the episode, then, I want to provide an account first of the socioeconomic and ideological context that cleared the space for the creation of the prison, and second, of how that system took shape in the United States to make it the world's all-time prison capital. Third, and in conclusion, though I won't give any specific policy recommendations, I will give some thoughts as to what the prison industrial complex implies about how we need to conceive changing the status quo. So to the first point. The prison, a secure, designated space for the confinement of criminals, has existed almost as long as time can remember. But the prison as we know it today is a relatively recent invention, dating back to the 17th and 18th centuries during the period known in Western Europe and the eventual United States as the Enlightenment. Up to that point in history, the prison functioned as a place for housing criminals before receiving punishment, either corporal or capital. In the Enlightenment, however, the prison came to be used as its own form of punishment by Europeans, first on their own colonies, then on their own populations, and eventually within the United States. It may seem hard to believe now, but the modern prison system was the result of intended reforms to make punishment more humane, as opposed to the brutal public spectacles of beheadings, floggings, hangings, drawing and quartering, etc. The roots of making the prison itself a form of punishment were twofold. Speaking to its religious roots, as designated most notably by John Howard in his 1777 piece, The State of the Prisons, the modern prison could operate as a penitentiary, a place to repay for one's sins. Prisons could be something akin to monastic life, the solitary conditions allowing the prisoner the opportunity to turn inward, away from the flesh to contemplate the matters of the soul, and to be made right once again. But the modern prison also had another aim. In 1786 and 1787, British utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham traveled to Khrushchev in modern-day Belarus to see his brother Samuel, who was managing industrial projects for Prince Gregory Potemkin, a Russian nobleman for whom he was working at the time. Samuel had the idea that in order to maximize the profit extracted from the prince's laborers, they could construct an observation tower to monitor workers from above, so that they would know that they would be being watched at all times. Jeremy would do his brother Samuel one better. What if, he thought, this model were applied to the prison, in a rotunda-like model of cells, with a watchtower placed in the center, where only those inside of the tower could see out, but the prisoners on the outside could not see in. The prisoners would never know for certain if they were being watched, but the possibility of being watched existed at all times. This model was the panopticon. Under these conditions, the prison could serve as its own form of punishment, one that didn't require corporal punishment, as the prisoners themselves were redeemed through labor under the auspice of the all-seeing eye. Moreover, as the workers produced, the amount that had to be paid for security would be exceedingly low, as the architecture would do most of the work unto itself. It should be noted that while Howard's ideas were drafted into the English Penitentiary Act of 1799 and Bentham's into the construction of Millbank Penitentiary in 1816, combined they facilitated the birth of a paradigm that would outlast any concrete physical structures, and along with them, a deadly combination of the creators' belief in the righteousness of their cause and a potentially bottomless source of wealth extraction. The road to hell, so it seems, was not only to be paved with good intentions, but also with gold. Now, how did this system take shape in the United States? Well, the first penitentiary in the country, Pennsylvania Walnut Street Jail, was built not long after the end of the American Revolution in 1790, and that model was further propagated throughout the course of the 19th century. If the story of the European prison system cannot be told without discussing colonialism and imperialism in Asia and Africa, its story in the United States cannot be told without that of slavery and its enduring legacy in the post-Civil War Reconstruction era all the way through to the present. There would not be an immense spike in imprisonment until the end of the American Civil War, after the ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, or the Reconstruction Amendments as they were called. Let's turn our attention specifically to the 13th Amendment, which passed in the United States Senate on the 8th of April, 1864, in the House on the 31st of January, 1865, and with its ratification being complete on the 6th of December, 1865. The text of the 13th Amendment reads as follows, quote, Section 1. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Section 2. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. End quote. If everything seems okay in the wording of the text of this amendment, I suggest we take a closer look and place it in its proper context. You see, the American Civil War had decimated the Southern economy, and with its no longer having its brutalized, unpaid slave labor force, it would have to find an entirely new way to structure its means of production. That was, of course, until the subclause of Section 1 of the 13th Amendment made for an important loophole that meant it wouldn't have to. Note the subclause of the sentence in Section 1, which reads, quote, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, end quote. This part of the amendment provided a clear opening through which the Southern states could carry on with a system that, while not called slavery in name, was for all intents and purposes no different. In fact, under a different moniker, the system could hide all that more effectively in plain sight. Taking advantage of the loophole required a two-pronged approach. First, they needed to find ways of criminalizing the newly freed black population. To do this, many Southern states passed what were known as the Black Codes, laws that were targeted exclusively at African Americans. Among the codes were, for instance, prosecution for idleness or not having a job. This crime was extremely easy to get charged for, as in a climate of being newly freed and with no work, and with all business owners being white. Second, find ways to legally appropriate the free labor of blacks, now using the 13th Amendment. In order to accomplish this task, they instituted what was known as the convict lease system, which allowed plantations, factories, and other businesses to rent out prisoners for an extraordinarily low price, the prisoners themselves, of course, not receiving a dime. What the 13th Amendment allowed, then, was not exactly an end to slavery, but simply a new way of weaponizing the criminal justice system to legalize a new form of cost-free labor. Prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, most inmates in prisons were white. The prison populations remained relatively small. After the emancipation, it went almost completely the other way around, and with it, the prison population inflated considerably. Not to mention that the convict lease system was in certain ways worse than its predecessor. There is, of course, nothing redeemable in slavery, but as slaves were the property of their owners, there was at least some marginal reason to keep them in at least some degree of physical health. Convicts, on the other hand, were borrowed from the state, and if worked to death, could simply be disposed of for new ones. To give you a sense of just how horrifying the conditions were, one account of prison labor on Mississippi plantations in the Yazoo Delta in the late 1880s describes prisoners having to sleep outside on the bare ground, receiving lashes for hoeing too slowly, receiving lashes for planting something incorrectly, or for not getting an adequate amount of cotton that day. If one attempted to escape, they'd be whipped until bloody or attached with a metal spur to the foot. Countless convicts died there from exhaustion, pneumonia, malaria, frostbite, consumption, heat stroke, dysentery, and shackle poisoning, or were just plain shot. Eventually, some of these forms of punishment, many of which originated with slavery, came to be incorporated within the confines of the prison itself, ushering in its internalized brutality. And it did do the trick for the Southern economy. Though it's a fact that's largely lost to time, the convict lease system was almost single-handedly responsible for the industrialization of the South. Now, I'm going to do a major disservice to tremendous bits of history here, but I'm skipping over them not to undermine their importance, but for the sake of both brevity and to make the point that I want to make today. We'll jump to almost a century later, to the 1970s, because it's here that the prison system, in its most immediately recognizable form today, takes shape and mass incarceration definitively begins. The 1970s marked the end of an arc in American history that began with the New Deal. The New Deal, of course, instituted by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt after the Great Depression, was a mammoth-scale project to get American workers and industry back on their feet, and it was a resounding success. And while it certainly improved the lives of white Americans disproportionately, it meant for important socioeconomic gains for Americans of color as well. But the 1970s saw the beginning of the significant rollback of the New Deal's achievements. Due to the expense of American labor, corporations began to see the opportunity for greater profits by outsourcing their labor overseas. While this favored the rise of service sector positions across the country, the mass shutdown of factories turned the once fabled factory belt or steel belt of America into the rust belt that it is today, laying waste to working class communities all over. Among those affected, the worst were African American factory workers for several reasons. With the added burden of having come from segregated, underfunded school systems, many were unable to attend college, leaving them with little to no alternative forms of employment. While some 70% of black workers in cities were blue-collar laborers at the start of the 1970s, by the end of the decade, their employment in cities dropped to 28%. Deprived of their livelihood and dependent on an ever-shrinking welfare system, many fell into despair, homelessness, and drug use. As this was happening, however, they were inadvertently becoming a human surplus once again, becoming ripe for criminalization and prison labor. Enter Ronald Reagan's drug war. Drawing a page out of history, the war on drugs was used as an instrument to once again take advantage of the poor, and particularly the poor minorities, to reclaim them as a source of profit. Even though drug use among Americans is relatively equal, regardless of class or race, the poor, and particularly the minorities, especially black men, were disproportionately targeted, rounded up, and locked away. That the drug war had little interest in helping actual users get back on their feet can be shown in the statistics, as hardly any effort was made to target kingpins, with 4 out of 5 arrests being simply for possession. Rather than addressing the socioeconomic displacement, rather than providing counseling or rehabilitation, drug users' behavior was criminalized. It was during this period that the population of American prisons skyrocketed. Now, why did it jump so drastically during this period specifically? Well, the drug war coincides perfectly with the rise in power of a conservative nonprofit group known as the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, among whose members are prominent business owners and politicians. According to one statistic, some 25% of state legislators belong to this group. Over the years, ALEC has held increasing sway over the passage of legislation, all in the interest of facilitating contracts between prisons and private companies to, in a manner not so different from the convict lease system, use prisoners as workers. To ensure that prisons would remain a stable source of labor, ALEC lobbyists have pushed for more hardline legislation, much of which has succeeded. Examples of their work can be seen with the adoption of the 3 strikes law, mandatory minimums, the lengthening of sentences, and of course, much of the legislation surrounding criminalizing drug use and the drug war. Among the companies ALEC has directly or indirectly helped facilitate the use of prison labor are Ace Hardware, AT&T, Boeing, Chevron, Dial Soap, Famous Amos Cookies, Hewlett-Packard, Idaho Potatoes, Nestle, Polaroid, Spring, the former airline TWA, and Verizon, and for many years Victoria's Secret and JCPenney, though they no longer do so. Many products, such as uniforms, hats, weapons, car parts, waterbeds, computer parts, etc., are manufactured by prisoners, and you wouldn't even know it. And what do the prisoners themselves get in return? They barely get paid cents on the dollar, and in many circumstances, they find it difficult to get jobs, they lose the right to vote, and of course, in many cases, they never again see the light of day, on top of all the factors that I mentioned in the very beginning. To offer a few more statistics, poor Americans are 20 times more likely to go to prison than anyone from the upper or middle classes. Minorities and black men in particular are 5 times more likely to be imprisoned than whites. And one bit of information that is even more staggering: there are now more African Americans under state supervision today than there were even under slavery. What the National Advisory Commission on Criminal Justice Standards and Goals said in 1973 rings even more true today, namely that the system is a shocking record of failure. So where do we go from here? As I said before, I don't have any immediate policy suggestions, but not because I don't think they're necessary, but because I want to caution against any approach that simply looks at the prison in isolation. What the prison industrial complex shows is that mass incarceration, and even the prison itself, are not brute, independent facts. The prison is the product of a society that opened up a space which made it possible, and so to truly challenge one, we need to challenge the other. If we want to ensure that however we ask criminals to repay their debt to society is just and humane, it requires us changing the society around it before we can understand its debts, or if we even want to understand criminal offenses in terms of debt at all. In the meantime, however, we should approach with skepticism any approach that threatens to heighten policing, security, etc. for the insurance of law and order. The prison industrial complex teaches us that there is no enunciation of these notions outside of their use, that we should never understand them independent of who speaks them and to what end. As history being any indicator, they are often deployed on behalf of particular groups who often use it against the less privileged as they see fit. I'll leave you with a thought inspired by Slavoj Žižek from a review he wrote of the film Zero Dark 30, in which he expressed his disgust for the film's toying with the question of whether or not torture of captives in the War on Terror helped save lives. He writes, quote, "Does torture save lives? Maybe, but for sure, it destroys souls," end quote. Something not all that different can perhaps be said of the treatment of inmates in the American prison system. Even if the statistics were different, and it did make the country safer, it certainly would not make us better. Because under the conditions as they are today, for the physical safety of those outside of the prison walls, the price is that a bit of the soul dies each day. With that, episode 4 comes to a close. You've been listening to WinksThinks. Thank you everyone for joining me, and I hope to see you next time.